welcome to the last session of the day. I'm Tracey Cooper. I've got the privilege of chairing this last session. And I feel really guilty because of our panellists on the last part, and also Kat, have been working hard all day with many of you doing workshops. So we've got a little drinks cabinet for them. We've got some music going, just to, of course it's public health, just to chill. Please, we're keen to hear your thoughts as well for the panel session, which follows Kat, who's going to inspire us on how to really embrace future thinking, planning, decision making. But just before we get into that, can we pop the slides on for a second, that first slide? Thank you. Those of you left in the room, can you hold your mobile phones up for a second? Somewhat random request normally, isn't it? Okay, so can you go on to www.menti.com, whatever your search engine is. So I've done that, and it'll say for a code. So if you put the numbers 459081 in, as if by magic, these will take you through a series of 4 questions. So those are all tailored to the event today. What your thoughts are, what your tips are, what your contributions are, and what we want to do between now and the end of the afternoon. But of course, you have to pay a lot of attention to Kat, and you have to pay a lot of attention to our panel. So good luck with that. But please spend the time just to go through those questions. They're really easy. And what we'll do, just before we close the day, with the powers of wonders of technology, we will show that visually as to what you think, all of you left against those 4 questions, so that we can just see what that looks like at the end of the day. So please try and find a minute to do that. Everyone's looking really, the glasses have come out, the phones are going like that. Are there any young people in the room? No, I'm joking. Okay, so just to set a little bit of context, and I know Sophie will have done that really well this morning. I'm not sure how much Brexit has been mentioned as the day has gone on. Is there a nod? Has it not? No, not a lot? Okay. Samina's going. I was asked just to say a couple of words in relation to long-term thinking and futures. And like many of us, from a public health perspective, have been involved a lot around Brexit. And we published a health impact assessment on it at the end of January, which looks at the impact on Brexit of health in Wales. And I think for me, if ever there is a time where, as a public sector with our partners in third sector and industry, we really need to invest the time in making good decisions for the medium and long term, it has to be now. And it's that whole point of time of we spend our days looking down, but every now and again we have to look up and out. And the power of that is doing it together based on what we know. And it's difficult to predict the future, but actually you have to take some steps to create our destiny. And to me, I think it's a really important time for us in Wales. We've got a rich environment, which we've been talking about all morning, and I'm sure Sophie pushed that. Please have a look at the health impact assessment, because it identifies the positive opportunities of decisions that we could choose to make now, that whatever the challenges that come, we'll traverse those in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years' time, so we can really create a healthier and sustainable Wales. And that is about thinking more in the long term and being courageous and considering what that means around our partners. So I will shut up with that context, and I'm delighted to introduce Kat. Hopefully you've seen Kat's biog. Kat's the co-founder of the School of International Futures, and will be inspirational, I'm sure, in really taking us through how we do this in a most simple way. So please join me in welcoming Kat.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for such a vivacious and energetic warm welcome. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here in front of you, because I'm normally talking about Wales to an international audience. But I was here when the Act was signed, I think in 2015, and I'm an avid follower of the innovation that you're leading here. So it's a huge privilege to return and also to take another step in this journey of exploration that you're on, that the rest of the world is watching attentively about. Let me grab what I'm going to talk about is how do you, as leaders in the public sector, apply what we've been talking about today in your organizations. And before getting into the left brain stuff, before talking about trends, strategic planning, institutions, and all that kind of malarkey, I'm going to remind us, and I hope that you hold this in your hearts, that at the end of the day, talking about the future is an inspirational human activity. It's about people coming together to discuss their common futures in a way that puts hope and fears on the table. It is an act, especially in a world of political confusion and when leadership is in a bit of a disarray. It is an act of deep empowerment of communities doing it together. So hold that as we have this conversation together. And this is the kind of vision of the future. It can inspire people. What is our future going to look like in Swansea or Mumbles? How is that going to change the rest of Wales? A little bit about myself. I'm going to draw upon some experiences working in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and previously doing strategy and foresight in the private sector, but also leading the not-for-profit organization School of International Futures. And there we work with a variety of leaders who are basically a bit like you, working in a volatile environment. Hendrik this morning talked about the fact that we need to do things differently, different ways of working, and some of the questions picked up on that. But at the same time, Sophie was saying, although the world is extremely volatile, there are some known unknowns as well. Although uncertainty feels very high, never before have we heard so much and known so much about the future at the same time. So as leaders, what can we do about it? And I'll draw upon some work that we've done working on Brexit with the Royal Society, so with Claire Craig, where we were looking at the implications for the higher education and research. I'll be calling upon some work that we did with the government of Oman, looking at how do you bring, in a very hierarchical society, how do you bring participative conversations about the future across men and women in a dialogue to create a vision of what alternative possible scenarios to 2040 look like? How do you integrate this into the Sustainable Development Goals conversation so when we're talking 2030, we're really talking 2030, not actually 2019? And how do we actually start getting our heads around all the changes that Fourth Industrial Revolution is going to create to the future of work, to the infrastructure that we need, to the communities that we live with, and how on earth can governments respond? So these are very tangible problems that we're facing on a day-to-day basis. So this is the challenge that we face. And Claire Craig actually very nicely had paraphrased this earlier on. So, does this mean that we're flying blind? And I hope that as a result of today's discussions, you've realized that no, we're not flying blind, that although there's not necessarily data and knowledge per se, there is evidence that we can harness. And what I'm hoping to spend the next 20 minutes with you today is to talk about how leaders have learnt to do this. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then hopefully you'll have a couple of tangible ideas to leave with. Does that sound okay? Good. Now, we've had quite a few definitions thrown at us today. And I'm bringing out these two, because they're two of my favorites. And I'll let you read them. And the reason why I really like them is because they bring out quite nicely three tensions or dynamics that I think are embedded in foresight. And I want you to see these dynamics as success criteria for you as leaders who are embracing futures and foresight techniques in order to embrace uncertainty rather than negating it or denying it or controlling it. And here are three of the dynamics, or the contradictions perhaps. First of all is when we do these processes or these visioning exercises or this collection of data, we tend to document this all in a report. But the true measure of impact, and I'm very glad that we had some questions about impact earlier, but the true measure of impact is in here. It's in mindset change. How do you do that? How do you create a baseline before you start intervening? Point number one. Point number two is around the fact that you, as leaders of the organization and your board and your trustees, need to mandate this process. And yet the content cannot come from you. It has to come from the amazing people in your organizations and people who you work with in your network. And thirdly, we are talking about the future, and we can have timeframes out to 2100. We did some very nice work on something that we call the bicentennial woman, the life of the first woman to live until she's 200. And some people say she may even be born yet. But, often you can be talking about 2300 AD, but the reason why you're doing it is to change the world today. So what's your vehicle for change? And realize that the future is just a story that you tell yourself in the present, and it enables you to shake things up and to challenge the official future. So, I think that we've very nicely heard these benefits of futures thinking and strategic foresight coming out today in all the presentations, really. But really, as a leader that's engaging with uncertainty and taking an organization in a certain direction, the reason why you'd want to use strategic foresight in your planning processes is really because of these three benefits. It helps you bring people together behind a desired vision. So that's the desirable outcome. It's the future that you want. At the same time, you can want all the futures that you want, and that's, often very frankly, that's what McKinsey's and PwC and those kind of consultancies will tell you. It's just like motherhood and apple pie, all the development plans for Kenya 2030. This is how you can all be Singapore. Up until now, there's poor quality foresight exercises that have just been like, oh, this is how you actually develop. What we also need is an understanding of how the world is going to change around you and potentially create scenarios and circumstances that you need to deal with that aren't the ones that you want. So how do you avoid strategic surprises? How do you avoid suddenly waking up and realizing that the population of Yemen is larger than the population of Russia in 2029, just because that's a straight line trend from demographics from today? Cho Kong, who's an amazing Shell scenario writer and thinker, talks about the inevitable future. He says when it's raining at the top, when it's, the snow is melting at the top of the Himalayas, sooner or later you'll actually end up having the floods in Rajasthan. Now, are you alert to those processes going on? But finally, the third benefit for doing strategic foresight is because, let's face it, by the time our time horizon arrives of 2030 or 2040, we're long gone. But the future that you want never happens, but also very often the future that you fear doesn't happen really. But the exercise of doing so builds agility and the ability, as you said, Tracey, to look up and out as an organization, to institutionalize these capabilities. So, question, does this resonate with you and your work? And perhaps, can I have a show of hands that first benefit, is that important for you and your organization? Would it be valuable for you to do a visioning exercise to understand how you and your organization are going to be in the environment that you're going to be operating in the future? Please put your hand up if that would be helpful. And it's not an either or, I just want to kind of get a sense. Now, I'm eyeballing that, and I want to say that's about 60, 70%? Okay. How about the second benefit? How many of you feel as if you're particularly vulnerable to a changing environment that may be more hostile to you and that you'd really like to think through what are the alternative scenarios facing you? Please put your hand up. Probably a little bit less, but more like 50, 60%. Okay. And amongst you all, which of you would see benefit in that third benefit that I've outlined, building that agility and responsiveness? Okay, I'm going to say that's about 90%, and I'm going to go to the ones that haven't put your hand up and ask why. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And similarly, when we talk to leaders, and they really get why it's important to invest time and energy at a time where we're all dealing with austerity and, unfriendly media headlines tomorrow and pressures. And when you ask them, why did they decide to put time and energy and resources away from something else into these exercises, they have 6 reasons why. Okay, different reasons why. Entry points as to what is the business benefit to doing this. Underlying reason why. First of all is risk management. Nothing like a bit of existential threat. Claire mentioned Singapore. That's a country who faced existential threat since its very foundations. Ask yourself, why did Singapore 5 years ago join the Arctic Council? It's about 6,000 miles away. Has lovely weather all year round unless they wanted to import the snow from the Arctic. Any thoughts? That's one reason. Excellent, thank you. Any other thoughts? Associated with a sea level rise? Potentially that, yes, as well. Something linked to those, which is that sea level rises and things freeing up in the oil in the Arctic so you can go in and explore also means that you can go across and ship. So all of Singapore's money comes from the Malacca Straits, its geostrategic importance of being one of the corridors through which most of the traffic in the world, naval traffic in the world, passes. If the Northwest Passage opens, their potential revenue and entire business and economic model collapses. That is why they do Foresight. And that's also why they were extremely good at bouncing back after the financial crisis of 1997, because they'd been doing this all the way through. Then strategic planning, good old strategic planning. You have to do that incredibly boring process every 1 to 2 years. It's always fictitious, never really does much. But sometimes it's a useful process in the organization, gets resources moved around. But we'd encourage you, during your trustees' conversations, when you're engaging with your staff about what your strategic plan should be, get them to stretch their horizon. It's not 1 to 5 years, but look at what's happening in your environment 10 to 20 years out. We're doing something on the future of terrorism, and the reason why we need to look 20 years out is because it can take that long to put some things on the agenda so certain organizations start tracking it. So look how long it takes you to shift that oil tanker and realize that although some things seem fairly obvious, that you need to start that conversation to start shifting that oil tanker early on. Very quickly, innovation. Boy, I'm sure that Black Cabs Inc. and Kodak had thought a little bit harder about the technological innovations and also new entrants into their market. Sometimes people go, that's going to happen to my work. Let's think about things through and the implications. Sector vision, doing this together as a sector. We just did something for the IATA, the aviation body. So they're looking collectively what the world of aviation looks like in 2035, I think. Organizational purpose, National Museum for Women in the Arts, we did something with. How interesting, because it's like, what does a museum look like in a world where there's virtual visiting and where artifacts are seen as being different in 3D printing world? What does it mean to be a woman nowadays anyway? What's the identity? So, and strategic narratives and mission. Someone mentioned the GAO, the US Government Audit Office. Amazing allies in the Foresight space, believe it or not. They have a really interesting story where they have a strapline now that says, from oversight to insight to foresight. So what they're saying is that the role of auditing went from oversight in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to insight. Like this is how we can make better decisions in the 90s and the early 2000s, to recognizing that actually their role within the American system is to encourage the departments to make effective long-term plans and policies. So, again, back to the impact question. There is a real bottom line reason why we should do it, and that bottom line reason is only going to get more significant in greater times of volatility. And to put a $M number onto it, because it's always really difficult, what we found is that in the business space and in the leadership literature, and this is from Harvard Business Review, there is more and more research showing, especially in the private sector, where you can measure widgets and pounds and outputs and stuff, that there's real benefits to doing that. And Professor René Rohrbeck as well from Aarhus University has got some studies that indicate your growth will be 200% of that if you are a future-prepared organization, and your profit will be 22% higher. And this is also the case for the public sector. We're seeing across the world, OECD, UN, organizations looking at what good governance, public service reform looks like. It's no longer linear top-down command and control approaches. It's much more about thinking of alternatives and realizing that that needs to harness other people's inputs. So here are some nice quotes, and I've just got the one from President Macron up, because this future generations thing that you're really pushing here in Wales is getting more and more common parlance globally, and that's, again, thanks to the work that you do here. But isn't it, I mean, what a surprise that this is important. It's like, if you care about health, we need to think about antimicrobial resistance. If we care about the well-being of our communities, we have to think about how the environment is going to change around us. And so there is a lot of innovation happening. Did anybody see this article in BBC Futures? I see some nods. Put your hand up if you saw it. Really great article. Read it. BBC Futures website a couple of days ago. It leans in very heavily on the innovations that you're doing here in Wales, speaking very highly of it, and also talks about a lot of other innovations from around the world. And I'm bringing out a couple of countries that I've already mentioned, Singapore, but also Finland. So Singapore is probably the best example of across the board, integrating it in all forms and fields of government. Finland does it fantastically in the executive and in the parliament. Costa Rica in particular uses it effectively in conversations with business and citizens. And I know that someone was asking a question about processes and the role of the civil servant. And I wanted to highlight some work that we're doing, which is for the Gulbenkian Foundation, based in Portugal, which is another example of a country that's doing quite interesting, innovative, future-facing policies. And they're taking that issue, which is that there are a lot of incentives to act short-termly. And we are developing over the next 2 years a framework, so it's a methodology and toolkit that allows for a systematic and impartial assessment of public policies according to intergenerational fairness. What that means is when a civil servant or politician is developing a set of policies to do something, that we can actually look at, are you mortgaging the future of your children? Now, if you're creating a budget, are you actually giving more debt for the next generation? If you're looking at decommissioning a nuclear power station, are you doing it to maximize the interests of the citizens that are voting you here? Or actually, are you waiting and taking into consideration the interests of the citizens that aren't yet born? It's a bloody nightmare. I have no idea how we're going to do it, although that's not what we said to the foundation. But I invite you all to come and chat to me about it, because this is in very, very early stages, and we're really looking forward to learn as much as possible tangibly how this can help you, especially because what is powerful about this is how you get the media and citizens involved, scrutinize it. Okay. Now, you will see that there was no UK flag there. The UK was really good at doing Foresight work, and however, you would probably not say that Westminster is a beacon of foresight and scenario planning at the moment. But there are still excellent pockets of work around and excellent people to work with and innovations to harness it. It was a real leader in this space up until about 2012, 2013, and there's still some amazing work being done, especially by the Government Office of Science, who just came out with an excellent report on transport, by the way, really, really fantastic and really worth reading. The MOD, as Claire said, who came out with their Global Strategic Trends work out to 2050. So always use your time and energy as leaders thinking about the so what's for your organization, never about doing all those trends and all that kind of stuff, because that's all out there. That's not the interesting stuff. But then throughout this time, Wales and Scotland have been beacons of hope and innovation throughout, including, and I know that many of you are public health leaders here, and they did some fantastic work reaching out to remote communities in Scotland about designing health services in over 10 years ago. Graham, I'm not sure, were you involved in that? Possibly no, one of your colleagues possibly. And then, of course, the work that you're doing here in Wales. And yes, I have to say, so John, so much your example is being looked at with interest in the rest of the UK. John Bird, Lord Bird in Westminster is trying to get a UK-based Future Generations Act going as well, and that would be a fantastic movement forward. Other examples of collaboration. This is some scenario work on health that Roger Dennis, who I thought was going to be here, but isn't, did for Canterbury in New Zealand. Now, what's interesting is that the King's Fund wrote about it and how much the NHS and health services could learn from that example. And now what you've got is he's actually here with the Cardiff and Vale Health Board doing some work together all this week. And the interesting work that they did was some scenarios work about the future of the health system in 2030. And you needed a visionary leader to create the mandate and the resources for doing that, because it's uncomfortable conversations. And he explored, basically, because of demographics, need is going to go up. Because of demographics, resources are going to go down because your tax base is reducing. And because of demographics, your workforce is going to go down as your population ages. And so they did some fabulous work, including taking a room this size and building what hospitals of the future and interactions look like. And then they took thousands of health professionals through that, immersed them in the future to understand what that looked like. This wasn't a report, this was about interaction, experiential futures. And the kicker to this story is that then the earthquake happened. And something that they thought that they had 18 years to prepare for happened in 18 seconds. Need going up, no money, total shortfall of staff. And the results, and again, this is impact, the results are that Canterbury Health had hugely better responses to all the mortality and morbidity that came from the earthquake than any other health area. So, there's also a really interesting piece of work being supported across the UK by the Health Foundation. Some of you may have seen Anne Bowers here, but what they're doing is they're looking at, a bit like Hendrik described, what are the changes facing the health sector? But more importantly, how do you collectively build the ability to respond to it? Because we all know it's just like different, non-communicable diseases, mental health, effects of inequality, etc. But why is it we know what we should be acting on, but we're still not acting on it? And that institutionalization is a really interesting question, and a question that I pose you, as well as how do you build the capacity to do it? So, Foresight. There is no silver bullet to integrate Foresight into your organization, I am afraid. But there is an interesting thing to examine, which is that, a bit like what I was saying in health, Nate Silver always says you need to detect the signal from the noise. So what's coming on the horizon? But the big challenge for you as leaders is not that. The big challenge for you is how, once you've detected the noise, do you respond to it? And that is where we get it wrong all the time. And actually, that is where the difference between the Kodak story and the Konica Minolta story. They both saw it coming. It's not that Kodak didn't see the change in the market, it's that they were able to act. And that is your challenge as leaders. I can give you some advice on what tends to work. You need to have an ecosystemic approach. There is no silver bullet. But to create an anticipatory, future-prepared organization, you need to do stuff in 4 areas, basically. The structure and the culture is fairly straightforward. Do you have a chief foresight officer? Do you have a dissent channel where people can question the official future? Do you have a culture that prizes and rewards this? Do you talk about it? But then, what about your processes and programs? Are you integrating this not just into your strategic planning processes, but your risk management, your learning and development frameworks? Are people rewarded for that? What about your budgeting? Something that DFID did very effectively was under Manoush Shafiq. All the top 10 programs needed to do scenarios out to 20 years, for example, Nigeria or Congo, before you ever dispersed money on that country program. So big investments should never go ahead without that kind of scenario planning being done. It's communications, not just the GAO example that I used, but are you talking about the 3 different horizons in front of you? And if you're an organization that really cares about value for money, talk about the value for money impact of Foresight. If you're one that really cares about working together with your communities, talk about the aspirational aspect. And most importantly, it's about the people and leaders. So you are so important at creating that mandate and that space for change, but are you listening to the others? Do you have an under 30 group that can put on the table things that nobody else is allowed to, for example? So, it's hard. It's like that Churchill quote, price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Well, the price of leaving a decent planet for the next generation is doing hard foresight work and focusing on it. The upside, however, and the reason why you need to be eternally vigilant is because if we don't think about that long-term horizon, we just slip without even realizing into the short term. But the upside is that it's actually really fun and it's empowering and people love it and it's really exciting. So the people, and that's my last slide-ish, the people are everything. And this is, if there's magic in foresight, it's this. And I've been putting this up so I can embarrass the hell out of Kathy. Ta-da! The people are everything, and that's what creates the magic. And Claire's already said that William Gibson quote, which is, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." We, who are leaders, are of the official present future. We are not going to be able to pick up any sodding weak signals at all. What we can do is mandate and listen to others, and that's what we have to do. And there is nobody better to listen to than the next generation. So we launched an award last year called the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners, because it's like, if we want to accelerate to a better 2030 future, let's pick up on those ideas and make them happen more quickly and get those ideas and those thoughts in front of decision makers like you. And it's my amazing and very happy pleasure that 2 Welsh women won the Special Award Prize for Europe. Kathy and Isabel Bottoms. And so the people that are going to help you create the future of your organizations are actually around you. They're in NGOs, they're at schools, they're in businesses. And so the question is, how do you harness that? So these are my final thoughts. Radical participation is integral. So please keep listening. Being future prepared is both an internal organizational challenge. You need to look at the nuts and bolts of how we're organized as an organization, but it's also external. It's about who we collaborate with in our conversations and why. And most of all, stick with it as a nation, doing the most exciting, innovative, groundbreaking work. It's going to be really tough, and having worked in this area since the late 90s, there's a lot of pendulum swings. But the nice thing, and I'm sure that people who have been in this space a lot will also agree, the pendulum comes back, and what's amazing is 5 or 10 years later, suddenly realizing that an idea or conversation that happened has suddenly flourished. So this stuff is the right thing to do in the kind of world that we're in, and it's important for you as leaders. So, thank you very much.